Today you're going to discover an incredible story of love, betrayal, and redemption set in the harsh lands of the American frontier. Meet Sarah McKenna, a young woman caught between family loyalty and an unexpected destiny that will change her life forever in the untamed territories of 1870s Wyoming. Before we begin this incredible story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're listening to this story from. The year was 1873, and the Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly under a blazing summer sun that seemed to scorch everything it touched. Sarah McKenna stood at the window of her father's ranch house, watching the dust clouds rise from the distant horizon, where cattle moved like dark spots across the golden grassland. At 22, she possessed the kind of natural beauty that made cowboys tip their hats and stumble over their words. Auburn hair that caught fire in the sunlight, emerald eyes that could pierce a man's soul, and a spirit as wild and untamed as the frontier itself. But today those beautiful eyes were filled with tears of rage and disbelief. Just an hour ago, her father, Thomas McKenna, had delivered news that shattered her world like a gunshot through glass. She was to be married, not to the gentle schoolteacher from town who had been courting her, not to any of the respectable young men who worked their family's cattle ranch, but to James Dalton, her father's sworn enemy and the most dangerous man in 3 counties. The McKenna Ranch had been Sarah's entire world for as long as she could remember. Built by her father's own hands after he returned from the Civil War, it sprawled across 5,000 acres of prime grazing land nestled between the rolling hills and the distant mountain peaks. The main house was a sturdy structure of hewn logs and native stone, designed to withstand the brutal Wyoming winters and the scorching summers alike. Sarah had grown up running through its corridors, learning to ride horses in the vast corrals, and helping her mother tend the vegetable garden that provided fresh food during the long months when supply wagons couldn't make it through the mountain passes. "Sarah, you need to understand the position we're in," Thomas had said earlier that morning, his weathered hands trembling as he poured himself another whiskey. The lines on his face seemed deeper today, carved by years of hard living and harder decisions. His once dark hair was now streaked with silver, and his broad shoulders carried the weight of responsibilities that seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. "The bank is calling in our loans. 3 consecutive years of harsh winters killed off nearly half our herd, and the cattle prices have dropped so low we can barely afford to feed what's left. Dalton owns half the territory now, and he's been buying up every piece of land that comes available. If we don't make this alliance, we'll lose everything. The ranch, the cattle, everything your mother and I built with our own sweat and blood." Sarah had listened in stunned silence as her father explained the dire financial situation that had been carefully hidden from her. She had known things were difficult. The meals had become simpler. New clothes were a rare luxury, and several of their longtime ranch hands had been let go over the past year. But she had never imagined that they were facing complete ruin. The bank in town had been patient for months, but their patience was wearing thin. Creditors were circling like vultures, and other ranchers in similar situations had already been forced to sell their land for pennies on the dollar. James Dalton had approached Thomas with an offer that was both a lifeline and a trap. Dalton would pay off all their debts, which totaled nearly $8,000, a fortune in those days. He would allow them to keep working their land under a partnership arrangement, provide protection from the increasing raids by desperate outlaws who had been targeting isolated ranches, and even help them rebuild their cattle herd. All of this generosity came with a single condition: Sarah's hand in marriage. It was a business transaction disguised as a wedding proposal, and Sarah was the commodity being traded. The hatred between Thomas McKenna and James Dalton went back 15 years, to a poker game in the Silver Moon Saloon that had ended in accusations of cheating, a gunfight that left one man dead, and a blood feud that had divided the territory ever since. Thomas had accused Dalton of marking cards during a high-stakes game, and when Dalton's associate reached for his gun, Thomas had been faster. The dead man had been Dalton's younger brother Michael, barely 19 years old and new to the frontier life. Though the shooting had been ruled self-defense by the territorial judge, James Dalton had sworn vengeance against the McKenna family. Over the years, that vengeance had taken many forms. Dalton had used his growing influence to make life difficult for the McKennas at every turn. He controlled most of the cattle buyers in the region, which meant the McKennas often had to travel hundreds of miles to find fair prices for their livestock. He owned the largest general store in town, and while he never refused to serve the McKennas, his prices for them were always mysteriously higher than for other customers. When Sarah had been younger, several promising young men had shown interest in courting her, only to suddenly lose interest after visits from Dalton's men. James Dalton owned the Silver Moon Saloon, the largest and most profitable business in 3 counties. He controlled most of the gambling, cattle trading, and freight hauling in the region. His influence extended to the territorial government, where several officials owed their positions to his financial backing. He commanded a small army of gunfighters and enforcers who rode under the banner of his Diamond D brand, men with hard faces and quick hands who enforced his will with ruthless efficiency. He was everything that Thomas McKenna despised, a man who took what he wanted without regard for honor, decency, or the traditional codes of the frontier. And now Sarah was supposed to marry him. "I won't do it, Papa," Sarah had declared, her voice shaking with emotion. "I won't be sold like a piece of livestock to that monster. There has to be another way. We could sell some of the land, move to California, start over somewhere else." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah could see the defeat in her father's eyes. Thomas McKenna was a proud man, a former cavalry officer who had served with distinction under General Sherman during the Civil War. He had seen the worst that men could do to each other, had survived battles that claimed the lives of thousands of his comrades, and had come west with dreams of building something lasting and good in this wild country. The idea of surrendering his daughter to his enemy was killing him, but the alternative was losing everything and watching his family starve or be driven from the only home they had ever known. "There is no other way, darling," Thomas had said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I've explored every option, asked every friend for help, tried everything I could think of. Dalton has made sure of that. He's been patient, building his power base year by year, waiting for the right moment to spring his trap. This marriage proposal isn't really a proposal at all. It's his final move in a game he's been playing for 15 years. Now as Sarah stared out at the vast expanse of prairie that stretched to the snow-capped mountains on the horizon, she felt trapped like a wild Mustang in a corral. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and pine, mixed with the earthy smell of cattle and horses that had been the backdrop of her entire life. How could she leave all of this behind? How could she share a bed and a life with a man she had been raised to hate and fear? She thought about her mother Elizabeth, who had died 3 years ago from pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter, when the doctor couldn't make it through the mountain passes in time to help. Elizabeth McKenna had been a refined woman from Boston, the daughter of a successful merchant who had given up a life of comfort and social standing to follow her husband into the wilderness. She had brought books, music, and culture to their frontier home, teaching Sarah to read and write, to appreciate poetry and classical literature, and to never compromise her principles for the sake of convenience or safety. Primeira contagem de palavras, 387. Segunda contagem de palavras, 387. Ainda está abaixo do target. Vou continuar a expansão. Elizabeth had also taught Sarah practical skills that were essential for survival on the frontier: how to preserve food for the long winters, how to treat injuries and illnesses with herbal remedies, how to manage a household with limited resources, and how to maintain dignity and grace even under the most challenging circumstances. Most importantly, she had instilled in Sarah a sense of her own worth and the belief that a woman should never allow herself to be treated as property, regardless of the circumstances. What would her mother think of this arrangement? What would she tell Sarah to do? Would Elizabeth counsel her daughter to sacrifice herself for the sake of the family's survival? Or would she encourage Sarah to find another way, even if it meant losing everything they had worked so hard to build? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, causing her heart to skip a beat. "Sarah, honey?" It was her father's voice, gentler now than it had been during their earlier confrontation, filled with the pain of a man who felt he had no choice but to betray his own daughter's trust and happiness. "James Dalton is here. He wants to meet with you before the wedding next week." Sarah's heart pounded like a war drum in her chest, and she felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead, despite the heat of the afternoon sun streaming through the window. She had seen James Dalton from a distance many times over the years, at cattle auctions in town, during supply runs when their paths would cross on the main street, and once during a particularly tense confrontation outside the territorial bank, when the animosity between him and her father had nearly erupted into gunplay right there in broad daylight. He was a tall man with dark hair and eyes the color of winter storm clouds, handsome in a dangerous way that made respectable women cross to the other side of the street when they saw him coming. Stories about James Dalton were legend throughout the territory. Tales of lightning-fast gunfights that left opponents dead in the dust, of business deals that ended with his competitors mysteriously disappearing into the vast wilderness, of a man who played by his own rules and answered to no authority but his own. Some said he had killed more than 20 men in fair fights. Others whispered that the number was much higher when you counted those who had simply vanished after crossing him. "Tell him I'm not ready to see him," Sarah called back through the door, though she knew it was only delaying the inevitable. Her hands were trembling now, and she pressed them against the cool glass of the window to steady herself. "Sarah, please." Her father's voice was pleading now, carrying a note of desperation that she had never heard before. "He's been more than fair in his terms. He could have simply taken what he wanted by force. He has the men and the influence to do it. But he's offering to do this proper, with a real ceremony and everything. The least you can do is hear what he has to say. Maybe he's not the monster we've believed him to be all these years." Sarah almost laughed at the absurdity of her father's words. Thomas McKenna, who had spent 15 years teaching her to hate and fear James Dalton, was now trying to convince her that the man might actually be reasonable. It was a measure of just how desperate their situation had become. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, drawing on the strength that had carried her through the loss of her mother and the countless hardships of frontier life. She was Thomas McKenna's daughter, and McKennas didn't run from fights even when the odds were stacked against them. If she was going to be forced into this marriage, she would at least face her future husband with her head held high and her dignity intact. Sarah smoothed her simple blue dress, one of only 3 good dresses she owned, and pinched her cheeks to bring some color to her pale face. She had chosen the blue dress deliberately. It was her most conservative outfit, high-necked and long-sleeved, designed to reveal nothing that might be construed as an invitation or encouragement. If James Dalton thought he was getting a willing bride, he was about to be sadly disappointed. She walked to the door with the measured steps of a woman walking to her own execution. When she opened it, she found her father standing in the hallway, his weathered Stetson hat clutched in his hands and his face etched with guilt and sorrow that seemed to have aged him 10 years in a single day. "Is he in the parlor?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite the chaos of emotions churning in her chest. Thomas nodded slowly. "Sarah, I want you to know that if there was any other way, any other choice at all—" "I know, Papa," she said, reaching out to squeeze his weathered hand. The calluses on his palm told the story of decades of hard work, building fences, breaking horses, fighting to carve a life out of the unforgiving wilderness. "I know you wouldn't do this if you had a choice. Just promise me one thing. Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll always remember that I love you and I know you love me too." Thomas McKenna's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Sarah saw not the stern rancher who commanded respect throughout the territory, but simply a broken-hearted father who felt he was failing the daughter he loved more than life itself. "I love you more than anything in this world, Sarah. Your mother would never forgive me for this." "Mama would understand," Sarah said softly, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed her own words. "She would want us to survive, to keep the family together whatever the cost." She walked down the hallway toward the parlor, her footsteps echoing on the polished wooden floors that her mother had insisted on installing despite the extra expense. Elizabeth McKenna had been determined to bring some measure of civilization and refinement to their frontier home, and the parlor had been her pride and joy. It contained the few pieces of fine furniture they had brought west from Boston: a mahogany settee, 2 matching chairs upholstered in deep red velvet, and a small piano that Elizabeth had played every evening after dinner. As Sarah approached the parlor doorway, she could hear the deep rumble of a man's voice, though she couldn't make out the words. Her father must have been making awkward conversation while they waited for her. She paused just outside the door, gathering her courage for what felt like the most important and terrifying moment of her life. When she finally stepped into the room, her first impression was of how the man seemed to fill the space despite the parlor's generous proportions. James Dalton stood with his back to the fireplace, one hand resting casually on the mantelpiece while the other held a cup of coffee that looked absurdly delicate in his large, weathered fingers. He was even taller than she had expected, probably 6 feet and 3 inches, with broad shoulders that strained against his well-tailored black coat. His dark hair was longer than was fashionable in polite society, touching the collar of his white shirt, and his face was deeply tanned from years of outdoor work. But it was his eyes that captured her attention and held it. They were indeed the color of storm clouds, a pale gray that seemed to shift and change in the afternoon light streaming through the parlor windows. Those eyes missed nothing as they studied her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. There was intelligence there, and something else, a weariness that spoke of hard experiences and difficult choices. "Miss McKenna," he said, setting down his coffee cup and removing his black hat in a gesture of respect that surprised her. His voice was deeper than she had expected, with a slight southern accent that suggested origins far from the Wyoming territory. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I know this situation is unusual, Mr. Dalton," she replied, inclining her head slightly but making no move to come further into the room. "I'm told you have a proposition to discuss." A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, and she realized that he was amused by her formal tone and obvious hostility. "Your father has explained the terms of my offer, I assume?" "He has," Sarah said coldly, "though I fail to see how purchasing a wife differs significantly from purchasing cattle or horses. Perhaps you could enlighten me." The smile disappeared from James Dalton's face, replaced by something that might have been respect. "You have your father's directness, Miss McKenna. I appreciate that quality in both men and women. It saves a great deal of time that might otherwise be wasted on pleasantries and pretense." He moved away from the fireplace, crossing the room with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to danger. Sarah noticed that he wore a gun belt beneath his coat, the leather worn smooth from years of use. The revolver itself was invisible, but she could see the outline of the holster against his left hip. Everything about him suggested controlled violence. A man who was comfortable with conflict and unafraid of its consequences. "To answer your question directly," he continued, stopping a few feet away from her, close enough to speak quietly but far enough to avoid seeming threatening, "this arrangement differs from a livestock transaction in several important ways. First, you retain the right to refuse. I won't force you into marriage, Miss McKenna. If you decide you'd rather see your family lose their ranch than become my wife, I'll respect that decision and withdraw my offer." Sarah felt a flicker of surprise. She had expected threats, intimidation, perhaps even physical coercion. This calm reasonableness was not what she had prepared herself to face. "Second," Dalton went on, "I'm not buying you, Miss McKenna. I'm proposing a partnership that happens to take the form of marriage. Your father's debts will be forgiven, your family will retain ownership of their land, and you will be treated with the respect due to my wife. In return, I gain a connection to one of the most respected families in the territory, and I hope a companion who can help me build something worthwhile in this country. And if I prove to be an unsatisfactory companion," Sarah asked, her voice dripping with skepticism, "then we'll both have to live with our disappointment," he replied simply. "I don't believe in divorce, Miss McKenna, and I assume you were raised with similar values. This would be a permanent arrangement for better or worse." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden cruelty. Instead, she found herself confronted with what appeared to be genuine sincerity. It was deeply unsettling. She had spent years imagining James Dalton as a monster, a villain who took pleasure in causing pain and suffering. This calm, articulate man who spoke of respect and partnership was not the enemy she had prepared herself to hate. "Why me?" she asked suddenly. "You're a wealthy man, Mr. Dalton. Surely there are women who would be happy to marry you without the complications of our family's history." "There are," he agreed, "but none of them are you." The simple statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Sarah didn't fully understand. She felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked away from those penetrating gray eyes. "I've watched you over the years, Miss McKenna," Dalton continued, his voice soft but clear. "I've seen how you handle yourself in town, how you treat people with kindness regardless of their station in life. I've heard about your work with the church ladies helping families who've fallen on hard times, and I know you helped deliver the Henderson baby when the doctor couldn't make it through the storm last winter. You're not just beautiful, though you certainly are that. You're strong, intelligent, and compassionate. Those are qualities I value more than wealth or social position." "And you think these qualities can be purchased along with my father's debt?" Sarah asked, though her anger was beginning to give way to confusion. "No," James said firmly. "They can't be purchased at all. They can only be freely given, and only if I prove myself worthy of receiving them. I'm hoping that time will allow us to move beyond the mistakes of the past and build something new together." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. This was not the conversation she had expected to have, and James Dalton was proving to be far more complex than the simple villain she had imagined. She found herself actually considering his words, wondering if there might be more to this arrangement than the cruel manipulation she had assumed it to be. "But our families have been enemies for 15 years, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father killed your brother. How can you speak of moving beyond the past when that blood stands between us?" For the first time since she had entered the room, James Dalton's composure seemed to crack slightly. A shadow of pain crossed his features, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He turned away from her, walking back toward the fireplace where he stood staring down at the cold ashes from the previous night's fire. Michael was 19 years old, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. He was barely more than a boy, full of foolish ideas about what it meant to be a man in this country. I brought him west against my better judgment, thinking the frontier might teach him some sense and responsibility. Instead, it got him killed. Sarah watched him carefully, seeing for the first time a glimpse of the grief that must have driven his hatred for her family all these years. Then how can you possibly want to marry me? How can you look at me without seeing his death? James was quiet for a long moment, his broad shoulders tense beneath his black coat. When he finally turned back to face her, his gray eyes held a weariness that made him look older than his 35 years. Because holding on to hatred is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, he said simply. I've spent 15 years letting anger consume my life, Miss McKenna. I've made enemies where I might have made friends, destroyed where I might have built, taken where I might have given. Michael is still dead, your father is still the man who killed him, and I'm still the man who swore vengeance. But what has any of that accomplished except to make all of us poorer in spirit? Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of fear and resentment she had carried for so long. This was not the ruthless villain of her imagination, but a man who seemed genuinely weary of conflict and genuinely interested in finding a different path forward. You speak of forgiveness, she said carefully, but can you truly forgive my father? Can you live peacefully with the man who took your brother's life? I don't know, James admitted with an honesty that surprised her. I know I want to try. This feud has cost all of us more than we can afford to lose. Your family is facing ruin. My own soul has been poisoned by years of hatred, and this territory remains divided and weak when it should be growing strong. Perhaps it's time to choose a different path. Sarah found herself studying his face with new eyes, looking past the reputation and the stories to see the man himself. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of long days spent outdoors, and a small scar along his jawline that suggested a violent past. But there was also something in his expression that she had not expected to find, a genuine desire for peace, for something better than the endless cycle of revenge that had defined their family's relationship. And you believe marriage to me will accomplish this miracle of reconciliation? She asked, though her tone was less hostile than it had been. I believe it's a start, he replied. A gesture of good faith that demonstrates my commitment to building rather than destroying. Your father is a good man, Miss McKenna, despite what happened between us. He's honest, hardworking, and respected throughout the territory. An alliance between our families would send a powerful message about the possibility of peace and cooperation. An alliance, Sarah repeated slowly. Is that how you see marriage? As a political arrangement? James moved closer to her again, and this time she didn't step back. There was something in his eyes that made her heart beat faster, though she couldn't quite identify what it was. I see marriage as whatever the two people involved make of it, he said quietly. It can be a political arrangement, a business partnership, a romantic fairy tale, or simply a practical solution to mutual problems. What I'm hoping, Miss McKenna, is that over time it might become something deeper than any of those things. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks again. There was something in the way he looked at her, something in the low timbre of his voice that suggested possibilities she had never considered. She had always assumed that if she ever married, it would be for love, the kind of passionate, all-consuming love she had read about in her mother's novels. The idea of building love slowly over time through shared experiences and mutual respect was foreign to her but not entirely unappealing. You said I have the right to refuse, she said, testing the boundaries of her situation. What exactly does that mean? If I say no, what happens to my family? Your family faces the same financial difficulties they face now, James replied without hesitation. I won't make their situation worse out of spite, but I also won't solve their problems out of charity. The offer I've made is contingent on your agreement to marry me. Without that agreement, they'll have to find another solution to their debts. And there is no other solution, Sarah said, though it was more of a statement than a question. Not that I'm aware of, James confirmed. Your father has exhausted his credit with every bank and lender in the territory. The cattle market is depressed, land values are falling, and there are no rich relatives waiting in the wings to help. I'm not saying this to pressure you, Miss McKenna, simply to ensure you understand the reality of the situation. Sarah walked to the window, needing a moment to think without those penetrating gray eyes watching her every expression. Outside, She could see some of their remaining ranch hands working with the horses in the main corral. These men had been loyal to her family for years, but if the ranch failed, they would be forced to find work elsewhere. There were other families in the area who depended on the McKenna ranch for seasonal work, and suppliers in town who relied on their business. The failure of their ranch would ripple out to affect dozens of other people. "May I ask you something personal, Mr. Dalton?" she said without turning around. "Of course. Have you ever been married before?" There was a long pause before he answered. "No, I haven't. But surely you've had relationships with women?" Another pause, longer this time. "I have. Though I suspect the kind of relationships you're thinking of are not the kind that would be appropriate to discuss with a lady." Sarah turned back to face him, feeling bold in a way that surprised her. "I'm not asking for details, Mr. Dalton. I'm trying to understand what kind of husband you would be. Would you expect me to share your bed immediately? Would you demand the full rights of a husband from the beginning?" The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah saw something flicker across James's face that might have been surprise or admiration for her directness. "That would be entirely up to you," he said finally. "I'm not a man who takes what isn't freely given, Miss McKenna. If you agree to marry me, we would start as strangers who happen to share a name and a house. Anything beyond that would develop naturally over time if it develops at all." "And if it doesn't develop?" Sarah pressed. "If I prove to be a wife in name only, then I would be disappointed but not surprised." James replied honestly. "I'm asking a great deal of you, Miss McKenna. I'm asking you to marry a man you've been taught to hate, to leave your family home and to build a life with someone you barely know. I can't expect you to also fall in love with me on command." Sarah found herself genuinely impressed by his honesty and his apparent respect for her autonomy. She had heard too many stories of frontier women who were treated little better than property by their husbands, expected to submit to demands for physical intimacy regardless of their own feelings. The idea that James Dalton would be willing to wait, to let attraction and affection develop naturally if they developed at all, was both surprising and reassuring. "Where would we live?" she asked, moving on to more practical considerations. "I have a house in town above the Silver Moon Saloon," James said. "It's comfortable but not particularly large. I also own a ranch about 10 miles north of here, closer to the mountains. The house there is bigger, more suitable for a family, but it's more isolated. The choice would be yours." "A family," Sarah repeated, feeling her cheeks burn. "You want children?" "Eventually, yes," he said simply, "if we're both willing and able. But again, that would be entirely your choice and your timeline." Sarah was quiet for several minutes, processing everything she had learned about this man who was so different from what she had expected. He was offering her choices where she had expected demands, respect where she had expected domination, patience where she had expected immediate possession. It was deeply confusing, because it made the decision she faced much more complicated than a simple choice between good and evil. "May I have some time to consider your proposal?" she asked finally. "Of course," James replied. "How much time do you need?" "A few days," Sarah said. "This is the most important decision of my life, Mr. Dalton. I don't want to make it hastily." "Take all the time you need," he said, then paused. "Though I should mention that the bank has given your father until the end of next week to settle his accounts. After that, they'll begin foreclosure proceedings." Sarah nodded, understanding the implicit deadline. She had less than a week to decide whether to sacrifice herself for her family's survival, or to let everything they had built crumble into dust. "There is one more thing," James said as he prepared to leave. "I'd like your permission to call on you again tomorrow evening, not to pressure you for an answer, but to give you another opportunity to ask questions and to allow us to become better acquainted. If we're going to be married, we should at least try to know each other beyond our family's shared history." "Very well," Sarah agreed, surprising herself with how easily the words came. James nodded, retrieved his hat from the side table, and moved toward the parlor door. At the threshold, he turned back to face her one final time. "Miss McKenna," he said quietly, "I want you to know that whatever you decide, I respect your courage in even considering this arrangement. It takes a remarkable woman to put her family's welfare above her own desires and fears." And with that, he was gone, leaving Sarah alone in the parlor with her thoughts and the impossible decision that would determine the course of the rest of her life. That evening, Sarah sat at her mother's old dressing table, brushing her auburn hair by the light of a single oil lamp. The ritual had always been soothing to her, a quiet moment of reflection at the end of each day, but tonight, her mind was too turbulent for peace. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw James Dalton's face, Not the monster she had imagined for so many years, but the complex, weary man who had stood in their parlor speaking of forgiveness and new beginnings. The house had been unusually quiet since his departure. Her father had retreated to his study with a bottle of whiskey, and she could hear him pacing back and forth across the wooden floors, his boots creating a steady rhythm that spoke of deep anxiety. They had not spoken about the meeting yet, but Sarah knew Thomas was waiting for her to come to him with her decision, hoping against hope that somehow his daughter would find a way to accept the impossible situation he had created. A soft knock at her bedroom door interrupted her thoughts. "Sarah?" Her father's voice was tentative, uncertain. "May I come in?" "Of course, Papa," she replied, setting down her brush and turning to face him as he entered. Thomas McKenna looked older than his 53 years as he stood in the doorway, his shoulders slumped with the weight of guilt and responsibility. His dark hair was disheveled from running his hands through it, and his eyes were red-rimmed from whiskey and unshed tears. "How did it go?" he asked quietly, though Sarah suspected he had been listening from the hallway during at least part of her conversation with Dalton. "It went differently than I expected," Sarah admitted, gesturing for him to sit in the small chair beside her dressing table. "He's not the man I thought he was, Papa. He's not the monster we've made him out to be all these years." Thomas studied her face carefully, looking for signs of what she might be thinking. "What do you mean?" "He spoke of forgiveness," Sarah said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "He said he was tired of hatred, tired of the feud between our families. He wants to build something instead of destroying it. And he treated me with respect. He made it clear that I have choices, that he wouldn't force me into anything I wasn't ready for." "And what did you tell him?" Thomas asked, though his voice suggested he already feared the answer. "I told him I needed time to think," Sarah replied. "He's coming back tomorrow evening so we can talk more, get to know each other better." "Papa, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Thomas nodded, though she could see the apprehension in his eyes. "Is there truly no other way?" she asked. "No other solution that doesn't involve sacrificing me to save the ranch?" Her father was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out across his weathered features. Finally, he shook his head slowly. "I've tried everything, Sarah. I've begged, borrowed, and pleaded with every person who might possibly help us. The bank won't extend our loan. The other ranchers are struggling just as much as we are, and land values have fallen so low that selling wouldn't even cover our debts. Dalton has been very thorough in making sure we have no alternatives." "But you think I should accept his proposal?" Sarah said, though it wasn't really a question. "I think," Thomas paused, struggling with words that seemed to stick in his throat. "I think James Dalton is offering you a chance at a life that might not be what you dreamed of, but could still be good. He's wealthy, he's influential, and despite everything that's happened between us, he's not a cruel man. I've heard stories about how he treats his employees, how he's helped families in town when they've faced hard times." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "You want me to marry him. I want you to be happy," Thomas said firmly. "But I also want you to be safe, to have a roof over your head and food on your table. I want you to have the chance to raise children and build a life, even if it's not the life you planned. If marrying James Dalton can give you those things, then yes, I think you should seriously consider it." "And what about Michael?" Sarah asked quietly. "What about the fact that you killed his brother?" Thomas's face went pale, and for a moment Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I've carried the guilt of that night for 15 years, Sarah. Not because I was wrong to defend myself, but because I took a young man's life and set in motion all the pain that followed. Maybe this marriage could finally put that ghost to rest. Maybe it could give Michael's death some meaning beyond just feeding the hatred between our families." Sarah reached out and took her father's weathered hand in hers. "Papa, I need you to know that whatever I decide, I don't blame you for the position we're in. You've worked harder than any man should have to, and you've always put our family first. None of this is your fault." Thomas's eyes filled with tears, and he squeezed her hand tightly. "You're so much like your mother, Sarah. She always knew how to find forgiveness and strength when the rest of us could only see problems. I just wish she was here to guide you through this." "She is here," Sarah said softly. "Every lesson she taught me, every example she set, every story she told me about choosing love over fear. She's with me in all of that, and I think she would want me to be practical while still holding on to hope." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, father and daughter united in their shared grief and their shared determination to find a way forward. Finally, Thomas stood and kissed the top of Sarah's head. "Get some rest, darling. he said gently. Tomorrow is another day, and maybe it will bring more clarity. After he left, Sarah prepared for bed, but sleep proved elusive. She lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch at night, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the tall grass, the soft hooting of an owl in the cottonwood tree outside her window. These sounds had been the soundtrack of her entire life, but now they felt like a lullaby for a world that was about to disappear forever. The next evening, James Dalton arrived promptly at 7 o'clock, just as the sun was beginning to set behind the western mountains. This time, Sarah was ready for him, dressed in her best green dress and wearing her mother's pearl earrings for courage. She had spent the day thinking about questions she wanted to ask, trying to understand the man who might become her husband. "Miss McKenna," he said as she entered the parlor, rising from his chair with the same respectful gesture he had shown the day before. "Thank you for agreeing to see me again." "Mr. Dalton," she replied, taking a seat across from him. "I must admit, I spent much of last night and today thinking about our conversation." "And what conclusions did you reach?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was genuinely curious rather than anxious about her answer. "I realized that I know very little about you beyond your reputation," Sarah said honestly. "If I'm going to consider marrying you, I need to understand who you really are, not just who people say you are." James nodded approvingly. "That seems wise. What would you like to know?" "Where did you come from?" Sarah asked. "How did you end up in Wyoming territory?" "I was born in Virginia," James replied. "My family owned a tobacco plantation that had been in our family for 4 generations. I grew up expecting to inherit a life of relative comfort and predictability. But the war changed everything." Sarah could hear the pain in his voice, the echo of old wounds that had never quite healed. "My parents died within 2 years of the war's end," James continued. "I sold what little land was left, took Michael with me, and headed west looking for a new beginning. I had some money from the sale, enough to buy the Silver Moon Saloon when we reached Wyoming territory." "And you've never regretted leaving Virginia?" Sarah asked. "Every day for the first 5 years," James admitted. "But not anymore. This territory is rough and dangerous, but it's also full of possibilities. A man can make something of himself here if he's willing to work for it." "What kind of something?" Sarah pressed. "A cattle empire," James said without hesitation. "I've been buying land strategically for years, acquiring water rights, building relationships with buyers back east. The railroad will reach this territory within the next decade, and when it does, the man who controls the best grazing land and has the most cattle will become very wealthy indeed." Sarah was impressed by his ambition and his long-term thinking. This was clearly not a man who made impulsive decisions or relied on luck to succeed. "And where do I fit into these plans?" she asked. "You would be my partner," James said simply. "In every sense of the word. I need someone I can trust, someone who understands this territory and its people, someone who can help me build something lasting." The conversation continued for another hour, covering his views on politics, religion, and his favorite books. With each question and answer, Sarah found herself more impressed by his intelligence, his honesty, and his genuine desire to build a better life. When he finally prepared to leave, Sarah found herself reluctant to see him go. "Tomorrow is Sunday," she said as he stood to collect his hat. Would you like to attend church with my family? I know it might be awkward given the circumstances, but I think it would help people in the community begin to accept the idea of peace between our families." James paused, his hat halfway to his head. "Are you sure that's wise? There are still people in town who remember the night Michael died. My presence might cause more trouble than it's worth." "Maybe," Sarah agreed, "but maybe it's time to stop hiding from the past and start building a different future. What do you think?" James studied her face for a long moment, and Sarah could see him weighing the risks and benefits of her suggestion. "If you're willing to be seen with me in public," he said finally, "then I'd be honored to escort you to church." As Sarah watched him ride away into the gathering darkness, she realized that somewhere during their 2 conversations, her feelings toward James Dalton had shifted from fear and hatred to something much more complex: curiosity, respect, and perhaps even the beginning of genuine affection. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp mountain air that made everything seem possible. Sarah stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the ribbons on her best Sunday dress, a deep blue silk that had belonged to her mother. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened her mother's pearl necklace, knowing that in a few hours she would be walking into church on the arm of James Dalton, making a public statement that would shock the entire community. The ride to town was tense, with Sarah seated between her father and James in the McKenna family wagon. Thomas had been unusually quiet all morning, his jaw set in the determined expression he wore when facing unpleasant but necessary tasks. James, for his part, seemed calm and composed, though Sarah noticed the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, alert for any sign of trouble. "Are you certain about this?" Thomas asked quietly as they approached the outskirts of town. "It's not too late to change your mind. James could drop us off at the church and wait somewhere else." "No," Sarah said firmly, though her heart was beating rapidly. "If we're going to do this, we need to do it properly. The whole territory will know about our arrangement soon enough. Better to face the gossip and speculation head-on rather than try to hide from it." James turned to look at her, and she saw something that might have been admiration in his gray eyes. "You're a brave woman, Miss McKenna. Not many people would choose to walk into a room full of their neighbors knowing they'll be the subject of every conversation for weeks to come." "I'm my father's daughter," Sarah replied. "McKennas don't run from fights." The First Presbyterian Church of Sweetwater stood at the end of Main Street, a simple white building with a tall steeple that could be seen from miles away across the prairie. As their wagon approached, Sarah could see other families arriving for the 11 o'clock service, their Sunday best a stark contrast to the dusty work clothes they wore the rest of the week. All conversation stopped as James Dalton helped Sarah down from the wagon. The silence was so complete that Sarah could hear the wind rustling through the cottonwood trees and the distant sound of horses stamping their feet. Every eye in the churchyard was fixed on the three of them, and Sarah could practically feel the shock and speculation radiating from the gathered congregation. "Well," she murmured to James, "I suppose there's no turning back now." "No," he agreed quietly, offering her his arm with perfect gentlemanly composure. "There isn't." They walked toward the church doors together, Sarah's hand resting lightly on James's arm, her father walking beside them with his shoulders squared and his head held high. The crowd parted before them like the Red Sea, creating a clear path to the entrance while whispered conversations erupted in their wake. Is that really James Dalton? What is Sarah McKenna thinking? After what happened to his brother? Sarah kept her eyes forward and her expression serene, though inside she felt as though she might be sick from nervousness. She had known this would be difficult, but the reality of being the center of such intense scrutiny was worse than she had imagined. Just as they reached the church steps, a voice called out from behind them, "Thomas McKenna!" They turned to see Bill Henderson striding toward them, his face flushed with anger and his hands clenched into fists. Henderson was a large man, a former miner who now ran a small cattle operation. His family had been friends with the McKennas for years, and Sarah knew he considered himself something of a protector of their interests. "Bill," Thomas said calmly, though Sarah could see the tension in her father's posture. "What in hell do you think you're doing?" Henderson demanded loud enough for half the churchyard to hear. "Walking into God's house with that snake? Have you completely lost your senses?" A collective gasp went up from the crowd, and Sarah felt James's arm tense beneath her hand. She looked up at him, and was surprised to see that his expression remained perfectly calm, though she could sense the coiled energy beneath his composed exterior. "Bill, this is neither the time nor the place for this conversation," Thomas replied, his voice steady but warning. "Like hell it isn't," Henderson shot back. "This man has caused nothing but trouble for honest folks in this territory, and now you're parading around town with him like he's some kind of respected citizen? What's he done? Threatened your family?" Sarah felt a flash of anger at Henderson's assumptions. While she appreciated his concern for their family, she resented the implication that she was nothing more than a helpless victim in this situation. "Mr. Henderson," she said, stepping slightly forward, "I appreciate your concern, but this is a private family matter. Mr. Dalton is here at my invitation, and I would ask you to respect that." Henderson's jaw dropped. "Your invitation? Sarah, what has he done to you? What lies has he told you?" "No lies." James spoke for the first time, his voice carrying clearly across the silent churchyard. "Miss McKenna and I are getting to know each other better, with her father's knowledge and approval. I understand that my presence here is unexpected, but I hope that in time the community will come to see it as a sign of positive change." "Positive change?" Henderson's voice rose. "You think we're all fools, Dalton? You think we don't know what kind of man you are?" The crowd was growing larger as people began to gather from other parts of town, drawn by the commotion. Sarah could see faces in the windows of nearby businesses, and she knew that word of this confrontation would spread throughout the territory within hours. "Bill, that's enough," Thomas said firmly, stepping between Henderson and James. "Whatever you think of Mr. Dalton, this is still the Lord's Day and we're standing in front of his house. If you have grievances to air, they can wait until a more appropriate time. Sarah could see that the situation was spiraling out of control, and she knew that someone needed to defuse it before it escalated into violence. She stepped forward again, this time moving to stand directly between the two men. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I understand your concerns, and I'm grateful for your loyalty to our family, but I am not a child, and I am perfectly capable of making my own decisions about who I choose to associate with. Mr. Dalton has shown me nothing but respect and courtesy, and I see no reason why that should not continue." "But Sarah," Henderson began. "Furthermore," she continued, cutting him off, "if you truly care about our family's welfare, you'll trust that we know what we're doing and support our decisions rather than creating public scenes that only make a difficult situation worse." The power in her voice surprised even Sarah herself. She had never spoken so forcefully to a man like Henderson, had never asserted herself so publicly or decisively, but something about the situation gave her a confidence she had never felt before. Henderson stared at her for a long moment, clearly struggling with his anger and his respect for the McKenna family. Finally, he shook his head in disgust. "I hope you know what you're doing, Thomas," he said, "because if this goes wrong, it won't just be your family that pays the price." With that, he turned and stalked away, several other men following in his wake. The crowd began to disperse, though Sarah could still feel curious and hostile eyes watching their every move. "Well," James said quietly, "that went about as well as could be expected." Sarah looked up at him, searching his face for signs of anger or embarrassment. Instead, she found what looked like genuine admiration. "You handled that beautifully," he said. "Not many women would have had the courage to stand up to a man like Henderson in front of half the town." "I meant what I said," Sarah replied. "You have shown me nothing but respect and courtesy. Whatever our family's history, you don't deserve to be attacked simply for attending church." The church service itself passed without further incident, though Sarah was acutely aware of the whispered conversations and stolen glances from the other parishioners. Reverend Morrison treated James with the same courtesy he showed every visitor, welcoming him to the service and making no reference to the drama that had unfolded outside. As they sat together in the McKenna family pew, Sarah found herself stealing glances at James. He participated in the service with apparent sincerity, singing the hymns in a rich baritone voice and listening attentively to the sermon about forgiveness and redemption. She wondered if he found the topic as relevant to their situation as she did. When the service ended, they made their way outside where a smaller crowd had gathered. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. While there were still suspicious looks and quiet conversations, there was also curiosity and what might have been cautious acceptance from some quarters. Mrs. Henderson approached them as they reached their wagon, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Mr. McKenna," she said quietly, "I want to apologize for my husband's behavior earlier. He means well, but he sometimes lets his temper get the better of his judgment." "No apology necessary, Martha," Thomas replied graciously. "Bill was looking out for our interests, as a good friend should." Mrs. Henderson turned to Sarah, her expression concerned but kind. "Sarah, dear, I hope you know that whatever decisions you make, you'll always have friends who care about you." "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," Sarah said, touched by the woman's kindness. "That means more to me than you know." As they drove back toward the ranch, Sarah reflected on the morning's events. The confrontation with Henderson had been unpleasant, but not unexpected, and she was proud of how she had handled herself. More importantly, she had seen how James conducted himself under pressure, calm, dignified, and respectful even when faced with open hostility. "Thank you," she said suddenly, turning to look at him. "For what?" James asked, genuinely puzzled. "For not responding in kind to Mr. Henderson's provocation. I know you have a reputation for dealing forcefully with people who challenge you. The fact that you chose restraint instead of violence says something important about your character." James was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "I'm trying to be a different man than I was, Miss McKenna. The man I used to be would have met Henderson's challenge with violence, but that man cost me my brother and 15 years of hatred. I'm hoping the man I'm becoming might have better luck building something worthwhile." Sarah felt something warm unfurl in her chest, a feeling she was beginning to recognize as the stirrings of genuine affection. This man was full of surprises, constantly challenging her assumptions and expectations. Perhaps, she thought, there was more hope for their potential marriage than she had dared to imagine. That afternoon, as they sat on the front porch of the ranch house watching the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains, Sarah made her decision. The events of the morning had crystallized something in her mind, a clarity that had been building through all their conversations, but had finally reached its full form during the confrontation at the church. "Mr. Dalton," she said quietly, her hands folded in her lap, "I've made up my mind." James turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious and attentive. Her father, who had been dozing in his chair, opened his eyes and straightened up, suddenly alert. "I'll marry you," Sarah said simply. "Not because I have no other choice, though that's certainly part of it, but because I believe you're a good man who's been trapped by circumstances just as much as I have. I think we might be able to build something worthwhile together." James was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him processing her words carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Thank you," he said. "I know this isn't the life you planned for yourself, and I want you to know that I don't take your sacrifice lightly. I'll do everything in my power to make you happy, Sarah. I give you my word on that." The use of her first name sent an unexpected thrill through her, a small intimacy that somehow made their arrangement feel more real and more personal. "When?" Thomas asked, his voice a mixture of relief and sadness. "As soon as possible," James replied. "The bank has given us until Friday, which means we need to have the ceremony by Thursday at the latest. I've already spoken with Reverend Morrison, and he's agreed to perform the service whenever we're ready." Sarah felt a flutter of panic at how quickly everything was moving, but she pushed it down. There was no point in delaying the inevitable, and a long engagement would only give the community more time to gossip and speculate. "Thursday, then," she agreed. "A simple ceremony, just family and a few close friends." The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah's few dresses were cleaned and pressed, with her mother's wedding dress being carefully altered to fit her smaller frame. The house was cleaned from top to bottom, and Thomas reluctantly sent word to his scattered relatives, though none would be able to arrive in time for such short notice. James proved to be thoughtful and considerate throughout the preparations, consulting with Sarah on every detail, and making it clear that this was her wedding as much as his, despite the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. He arranged for flowers to be brought from Denver, hired a photographer to document the occasion, and even commissioned a small wedding cake from the bakery in town. On Wednesday evening, the night before their wedding, James came to the ranch for what they both knew would be their last conversation as unmarried people. They sat in the parlor where they had first met, the same room that had witnessed so many important moments in their brief courtship. "Are you nervous?" Sarah asked, smoothing her hands over her simple green dress. "Terrified," James admitted with a rueful smile. "I've faced down armed men, built a business from nothing, and survived more dangerous situations than I can count. But the thought of being responsible for your happiness for the rest of our lives, that scares me more than anything I've ever faced." Sarah felt a rush of affection for his honesty. "I'm frightened too," she confessed. "But I'm also hopeful. I think we have a chance to make this work, James, I truly do." The wedding ceremony took place Thursday afternoon in the same church where they had faced down the community's skepticism just a few days earlier. Sarah wore her mother's ivory silk dress, altered to fit her figure and decorated with the wildflowers that James had arranged to be gathered from the mountain meadows. She carried her mother's pearl-handled prayer book and wore the same pearl necklace that had given her courage on Sunday morning. The guest list was small, but significant. Thomas walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes, while a handful of family friends and neighbors filled the front pews. Even Bill Henderson attended, though he sat in the back with his arms crossed and a skeptical expression on his weathered face. Reverend Morrison performed the ceremony with dignity and warmth, focusing on themes of redemption, new beginnings, and the power of love to heal old wounds. When James slipped the simple gold band onto Sarah's finger, she felt a surprising sense of rightness, as though this moment had been inevitable all along. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Morrison announced, and Sarah felt her heart skip a beat as James leaned down to brush his lips gently against hers. It was a chaste kiss, appropriate for their public setting, but it sent warmth spreading through her entire body. The reception was held at James's house above the Silver Moon Saloon, a space that had been transformed for the occasion with flowers, candles, and enough food to feed everyone who had attended the ceremony. Sarah was surprised by how comfortable and elegant the rooms were, decorated with fine furniture and books that spoke of James's education and refinement. As the evening wore on and the guests began to depart, Sarah found herself growing increasingly nervous about what would happen next. She and James had discussed the practical aspects of their marriage, but they had carefully avoided talking about the more intimate details of their wedding night. Finally, they were alone. James poured himself a whiskey and offered one to Sarah, who accepted it gratefully. They stood by the window overlooking Main Street, watching the last of the celebration lights being extinguished in the buildings below. "Sarah," James said quietly, "I want you to know that nothing has to happen tonight that you're not ready for. We can take as much time as you need to feel comfortable with all aspects of marriage." Sarah sipped her whiskey, feeling the burn of the alcohol give her courage for what she needed to say. "James," she said, turning to face him, "I've been thinking about this all week, and I've come to a conclusion. We're married now, for better or worse. We're going to be sharing a life, a home, hopefully a future. I don't want to spend months or years tiptoeing around each other, wondering when or if we'll become truly husband and wife." James studied her face carefully. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I want to start our marriage as we mean to go on," Sarah said, her cheeks burning with embarrassment but her voice steady. "With honesty, with courage, and with a willingness to take chances on each other." Something shifted in James's expression, a warmth and desire that he had carefully kept hidden throughout their courtship. "Are you certain?" he asked, moving closer to her. "Because once we cross this line, there's no going back. We'll truly be husband and wife in every sense." "I'm certain," Sarah said, and she was surprised to realize that she meant it. "I want to be your wife, James. Completely." What happened next surprised them both with its tenderness and passion. James was gentle and patient, taking time to help Sarah overcome her nervousness and inexperience. But there was also a fire between them that neither had expected, a chemistry that transformed their practical arrangement into something much deeper and more meaningful. As they lay together afterward, Sarah's head resting on James's chest, she realized that everything had indeed changed. The man she had married out of necessity had become someone she genuinely cared for, someone she could imagine building a life with based on mutual respect, growing affection, and shared dreams. "No regrets?" James asked softly, his fingers stroking through her hair. "None," Sarah replied, and she meant it. "What about you?" "Only that we waited so long to find each other," James said, pulling her closer. "I think we're going to be very happy together, Mrs. Dalton." Sarah smiled at the sound of her new name. "I think so too, Mr. Dalton. I think so too." 6 months later, Sarah stood on the porch of their new house at James's ranch in the mountains, watching her husband work with the horses in the main corral. Her hand rested protectively over the small swell of her belly, where their first child was growing. The morning sickness had been difficult, but the joy of knowing she was carrying James's baby more than made up for the discomfort. Their marriage had indeed exceeded both their expectations. What had begun as a business arrangement had blossomed into genuine love, built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared values, and growing intimacy. James had proved to be everything he had promised: a devoted husband, a successful partner, and a man committed to building something lasting and good. The feud between their families had ended the day they married, replaced by a grudging peace that was slowly warming into actual cooperation. Thomas had moved to a smaller house in town but visited regularly, clearly pleased with his daughter's happiness. Even Bill Henderson had come around, eventually admitting that James Dalton was not the monster he had believed him to be. As Sarah watched her husband approach the house, his face breaking into the smile that was reserved just for her, she marveled at how dramatically her life had changed. She had entered marriage expecting sacrifice and duty, but had found love, partnership, and the promise of a bright future. "How are you feeling today, Mrs. Dalton?" James asked as he climbed the porch steps and pulled her into his arms. "Perfect," Sarah replied, meaning every word. Absolutely perfect. And as they stood together watching the sun set over their mountain valley, Sarah knew that sometimes the most unexpected paths led to the most extraordinary destinations. Their forced marriage had indeed changed everything, but not in the way anyone could have predicted. End.